So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Kathy Carruth's book, Unclaimed Experience. So we just started with this book in the previous session, and we'll just continue from where we left last time. Now on your screen you should be able to see the section titled A Double Wound. And we were talking about the doubleness of trauma in terms of how there's a repetitive quality of trauma, a recursive quality of trauma, but also the uncanny quality of trauma, something which can only emerge from the other side. Something which can never quite be understood from the non-suffering position, right? So that quality of enigma, that quality of mystery is also there, and that should be acknowledged, and Carruth does acknowledge that, revising and drawing on Freud's idea of repetition. So as a repeated infliction of a wound, the act of transred calls up the originary meaning of trauma itself in both English and German. The Greek trauma, a wound, originally referring to an injury inflicted on a body. I mean, the word trauma comes from the Greek word. It comes from a physical wound, a corporeal wound, a wound which is inflicted on the body. In its later usage, particularly in the medical and psychiatric literature, and most certainly in Freud's text, the term trauma is understood as a wound inflicted not upon the body but upon the mind. But what seems to be suggested by Freud and beyond the pleasure principle is that the wound of the mind, the breach in the mind's experience of time, self, and the world, is not like the wound of the body, a simple and healable event, but rather an event that, like the transred's first infliction of a mortal wound on the disguise Clorinda in the duel, is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly, to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again, repeatedly, in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor. Now, what this long sentence does in a very interesting way is it moves away from the historical understanding of trauma. Originally, the idea of trauma was that a wound on the body. Now, when it comes to Freud, and this is again the reason why Freud's significance and relevance is so strong, even today, despite the fact that his theories have been debunked. But he was one of the first people to talk about the mind injury, right? The injury that happens in the mind, not just in terms of what happens to the body, but the injury which cannot be seen. And the invisibility of trauma is obviously part of the unknowability, it's part of the enigma of trauma in terms of that it cannot be really understood. Now, what that connects, obviously, is the idea of the mind and cognition, because if the mind becomes interrupted, if the mind becomes unsettled, and we talked about, if you remember, when we were reading Manto's stories, we talked about the interrupted self, the idea of the interrupted, shattered subject, and that's something similar happening here as well, in terms of how the mind of the wounded mind becomes not healable in the way that a wounded body can be, right? Because you don't quite know what to heal, you don't quite know where to heal, you don't quite know how to heal. There is this invisibility about trauma, there's this enigma about trauma, and that becomes part of the traumatic condition. Now, interestingly, what Carruth is saying also here, drawing on the transred Clorinda episode that we talked about last time, is how the only way we can understand, the only way we can experience trauma is through repetition. The repetitive actions of the survivor trauma, the way the survivor repeats trauma, that's the only way that one can possibly understand, because otherwise, and this is something which we saw in Beloved as well, there's no time to experience trauma, it just enters the consciousness directly. And the suddenness of trauma, the suddenness, the abruptness of the event is exactly what defines it ontologically, what shapes it, what informs it ontologically as the traumatic moment. So just as transred does not hear the voice of Clorinda until the second wounding, so trauma is not locatable in a simple violent or original event in an individual's past, but rather in a way that is very unassimilated nature, the way it is precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later on, right? So it can only be understood belatedly, and we talked about the belated quality of trauma even in Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? So the moment of trauma is the moment of enigma, the moment of mystery, and the voice can only be heard later. when the first repetition happens, right? So that moment of repetition is also, in a way, the moment of articulation. So it can only be articulated belatedly after the event, right? So that becomes part of the traumatic condition. And in the first instance, it's simply not known, and that unknowability about trauma is interesting for us to map. Now, and of course, we are drawing on interesting stories and works of literature and fiction. Now, let's just come to what Carruth is trying to say. That, and this should be on the screen, that in a delayed appearance, and this is exactly what she says in the very next paragraph, the end of the next paragraph, in its delayed appearance and its belated address cannot be linked only to what is known, but also to what remains unknown in our very actions and our language, right? So in the previous session, if you remember, Carruth had talked about how the interface of literature and psychoanalysis, or the convergence, is so complex, is so good, precisely because there is this interplay of what is known and what is unknown, right? And that interplay is interesting, and that is exactly why these two disciplines, these two orders of knowledge and truth converge so well and so complexly. So the idea of what remains unknown in actions and language, that becomes central to the ontology of trauma, right? So, and again, if you go back to something like Catherine Malibu, if you remember Malibu's text, The New Wounded and the Ontology of the Accident, she spends a lot of time talking about how the accident by definition is something which is not described or not describable to a large extent. It is outside the radius of description. So what is the purpose of this book, Cathy Carruth's Unclaimed Experience? And we did allude to the title a little bit, unclaimed, as in, it's not claimed, no one wants to claim it. It cannot be claimed in a certain extent because it cannot be classified, it cannot be understood, it cannot be navigated, it cannot be calibrated. So what happens to that experience? Now, in this book, I explore the ways in which texts of a certain period, the texts of psychoanalysis, of literature, and of literary theory, both speak about and speak through the profound story of traumatic experience. Rather than straightforwardly describing actual case studies of trauma survivors or attempting to elucidate directly the psychiatry of trauma, the chapters that follow explore the complex ways that knowing and not knowing are entangled in the language of trauma and in the stories associated with it. So this entanglement of the known and the unknown, and the acknowledgement of the entanglement, is exactly the first real original step in trauma studies, the first real innovative step in trauma studies, right? And that is the structure of this book, right? So this is what Carruth is setting out to do. And the next page, she talks about if traumatic experience, as Freud indicates suggestively, is an experience that is not fully assimilated as it occurs, then these texts, each in its turn, asks what it means to transmit and to theorize around a crisis that is marked not by a simple knowledge, but by the ways in it simultaneously defies and demands our witness, right? So witnessing, again, it becomes a very important condition. Someone is witnessing trauma, but not understanding it, right? So that quality of not being understood remains, and that is part of the traumatic design, that is part of the ontology of trauma, the ontology of the wound. Such a question, I will argue, whether it occurs within a strictly literary text or in a more deliberately theoretical one, can never be asked in a straightforward way, but must indeed also be spoken in a language that is always somehow literary, a language that defies even as it claims our understanding, right? So there's a really brilliant definition of the literary language. So what is a literary language? It is something which defies our understanding, at the same time it claims our understanding. It's a stylized order of understanding, a stylized order of representation. And in a certain sense, literature, or the literary language, is also about defamiliarization. And this is the reason why I named this course Trauma and Literature. Right, so we have texts like Urvashi Butalia's Other Side of Silence. We have books of philosophy, but what we can see that what Carruth is trying to do in a very philosophical way is to acknowledge the value of literature in terms of understanding trauma, because literature is also a play between what is known and what is unknown, what will always stay unknown, and secondly, literature is also a production of strangeness, a production of defiance. It's something which the language of literature is something which claims our understanding, which warrants understanding, which invites us to understand, while at the same time it defies our understanding, right? So there is always the excessive, incomplete quality about literary language, something which transcends very surface, superficial understanding of words and meanings, and therein lies the quality of reading between the lines, right? That's something which we see as very common parlance in literature, right? So that there is the idea of the literary language, something which defies as well as claims our understanding. And mind you, these are not seen as ontological opposites. The defiance of understanding and the claiming of understanding are connected categories in a large extent, and that is the ambivalence of literature, the ambivalent attitude of the literary language that Carruth is highlighting and almost celebrating to a large extent. Okay, so there is this quality that Carruth talks about. Now, so what are the features in the text that Carruth is looking at? I mean, of course, she's drawing on Lacan, she's drawing on Freud, but what is the main principle that informs this book? And this is something that she says, and this should be on your screen. My main endeavor is rather to trace in each of these texts a different story, the story of the textual itinerary of insistently recurring words or figures. The key figures my analysis uncovers and highlights the figures of departure, falling, burning, or awakening. In the insistence here engender stories that in fact emerge out of the rhetorical potential and the literary resonance of those figures, a literary dimension that cannot be reduced to the thematic content of the text or to what the theory encodes, and that beyond that we can know, beyond what we can know or theorize about, stubbornly persists in bearing witness to some forgotten wound, right? So the last bit is something that I want to spend some time with. The forgotten wound, the abundant wound, right? So what she says up front is that literary dimension should not be reduced to what the text is trying to say in the level of theme or content, or whatever the theory is trying to encode. But what is doing is the idea of literary language and the uniqueness of literary language lies in the fact that it can point to some forgotten wound. It can point to something which is not represented, something which is some kind of an aporia. Aporia is obviously that the state which cannot be articulated, the state which cannot be represented, the state which cannot be crossed. Aporia, the fault line of experience, right? So. And if you take a look at the title of Carruth's book, Unclaimed Experience, there seems to be some kind of a spatial quality. It's some kind of a space that no one wants to claim. It's some body. There's a corporeal, spatial quality, and a physical quality, an anatomical quality about this idea that there's something which no one wants to claim, no one wants to touch. And you can think of something like Tobatek saying, the unclaimed body at the end. The unclaimed body of earth at the end, which is Tobatek's in the village. No one wants to claim it. India doesn't want to claim it. Pakistan doesn't want to claim it. The two new nations don't want to claim it. So where is that? Where will that go? It just becomes an unclaimed earth, an unclaimed piece of land, and in process it becomes an unclaimed experience, which is the traumatic experience of Tobatek Singh. Now, the idea of stubbornly persisting and bearing witness to some forgotten wound, the stubbornness is very much part of the literary language, something which stubbornly defies meaning, stubbornly defies, standard close meaning. So any great work of literature, especially when it comes to trauma fiction or, something which talks about the complexities of consciousness, will always defy simple meanings, will always defy closed meanings, and this lack of closure or the non-closure of this kind of fiction is exactly what makes it such a unique vehicle to represent the traumatic mind, and this is the reason why someone like Carruth turns to literature to take a look at things which are more complex than what meets the eye, that what is between the lines, what is not said, what cannot be said, the known and the unknown, how they are brought together and articulated, not necessarily as ontological opposites, but as connected categories. Right, now, and there's some section on Freud that Carruth talks about, and we'll skip this a little bit, and then we'll come to she talks about Paul de Man, and so we can see that how the force of deconstruction is very much there, and that's something which we see in a very rich way in the idea of post-structuralism informing trauma fiction, trauma theory. We have seen that already in Catherine Malabou's works, The New Wounded and the Ontology of the Accident. So we see how Carruth also is bringing in Freud, bringing in Paul de Man, bringing in other philosophers of this tradition in terms of understanding trauma through a very rich interdisciplinary lens. Now, trauma and history. The story of trauma, then, as a narrative of a belated experience, far from telling of an escape from reality, the escape from a death, or from its referential foes, rather attests to its endless impact on a life. So there is this endless quality about trauma, the sort of self-mutating quality about trauma, and the fact that it's never over. The lack of closure that trauma creates is something which we must pay attention to as students of trauma. In Tasso's story, indeed, as we read it in Freud, Tansred does not escape the reality of death's impact, of the wounding accident, and of Clorinda's death, but rather has to live it twice. There is no escape from trauma, so the perpetrator of trauma doesn't manage to escape. Rather, the perpetrator of trauma has to experience it twice, and he can only understand it in the second experience. So that's the paradox of trauma. The crisis at the core of many traumatic narratives, as I showed concretely in my readings of Freud, Durand, and Lacan, often emerges indeed as an urgent question. So what is that urgent question? Is the trauma the encounter with death, or the ongoing experience of having survived it, right? So is it an encounter with death, as in suspension of life as we know it, or is it some kind of an ongoing experience of having survived death? And that answer is never clear. So there is that closure quality of trauma in terms of its complete integration into absence, which is death, but also this ongoing performative quality of trauma in terms of how it keeps negotiating the strategies of survival, the coping mechanisms, the strategies of survival through which death is deferred and deferred. So we can already see the Derridan ring coming in, the deconstructionist ring coming in. So at the core of these stories, I would suggest, is there's a kind of double telling, the oscillation between a crisis of death and the correlative crisis of life. So on one hand, there is this crisis of death in terms of how death is the end of everything, and that is the biggest crisis which produces absence. And on the other, the correlative with the crisis of life, and how there's this constant effort in life to stall death, to move away from death, to survive death, the strategies to survive death. And both go hand in hand. The oscillation, that's the word that she's using, the oscillation between death and life, the oscillation between the struggle not to die and the struggle to live, right? So that oscillation becomes almost the correlative, the double telling of trauma. So between the story of the unbearable nature of an event and the story of the unbearable nature of its survival, and you can look at the connections over here, the commonalities. Both have crisis, both have unbearability, something which is something which exceeds the bearable parameters, the parameters of knowledge, right? The parameters of endurance. So there is the unbearable quality there in both spectrum, the both ends of spectrum. Now, these two stories, both incompatible and absolutely inextricable, ultimately define the complexity of what I referred to as history in the text that I read. So in Moses and monotheism, so it brings about the different kinds of history in the historical books on trauma, which are anthropological in quality, evolutionary in quality. But what runs across all these books, the Freud book, the Durand book, and the Lacan book, is the oscillation between the struggle to live and the struggle to die, the struggle to defer death and the struggle to live life in a way which is part of the deferral, right? So the death drive and the life drive both sort of combine together in very complex ways because they're not compatible, right? They are completely incompatible, and that creates the traumatic condition, the incompatibility, right? And that is the so unhinged quality that we can see. And if you remember, we talked about this unhinged quality in Slaughterhouse-Five, the Vonnegut novel, where we have Billy Pilgrim's character as someone who's so unhinged, suspended, not quite integrated in space and time. So the time-traveling narrator in that novel is not really an agentic time traveler. It's not really an empowered traveler because he can travel time. He's more of an imprisoned traveler because he moves across different bubbles of time in which he is imprisoned in different capacities. Right, so and now Carruth comes to the bit that she started off with. I mean, when she, if you remember the opening of this book, where she acknowledges Freud's legacy as offering the traumatic repetition quality, but at the same time she moves on from that. She extends that into the voice of the other, the otherness. And again, we can talk about, we can connect this to Ulrich Bottalia's book as well, The Other Side of Silence. Now she comes back to this point, the voice of the other. The theoretical and literary thrust of the present book can thus be illustrated in another way as well through Tasso's story and through Freud's example of the crying wound, right? See, the voice of the wound that can only emerge through the wound. For a while, the story of Tancred, the repeated thrust of his unwitting sword and the suffering he recognizes through the voice he hears, represents the experience of an individual traumatized by his own past, the repetitions of his own trauma as it shapes his life. The wound that speaks is not precisely Tancred's own, but the wound, the trauma of another, right? So interesting is the way how there's some kind of transmission happening, because the wound is actually the other person's wound, but the trauma is Tancred's trauma. So there's some kind of transmission which comes from the wound, from the sufferer to the perpetrator, right? So you can see how trauma cuts across binaries. It is possible, of course, to understand the other voice, the voice of Clorinda, within the parable of the example, to represent the other within the self that retains the memory of the unwitting traumatic events of one's past. So that reading obviously is valid, that Clorinda can be seen as the inside ego of Tancred, so that wounded self that one carries within himself. So again, we can connect this to a certain extent to Septimus Smith, who has this sort of shattered subject inside his body, right? So there are these multiple personalities, multiple selves, the traumatized self, the bruised self, the shattered, fragile self, and of course the superficial self which appears. That reading is so valid. But we can also read the address of the voice here not as a story of the individual in relation to the events of his own past, but as a story of the way in which one's own trauma is tied up with the trauma of another, the way in which trauma may lead, therefore, to the encounter with another through the very possibility and surprise of listening to another's wound. Now, I stop at this point today, and I'll unpack this a little bit because this is so brilliant. Now, what Carruth is offering is a movement away from the self-absorbed ego of the traumatic subject and instead offering an intersubjective experience to trauma. So she's almost equating trauma with empathy to a certain extent. It's possible that if subjects share a trauma, that the understanding of the other can perhaps be accentuated, although it will never be complete. It will never be full. It will never have the knowledge of trauma, as we discussed earlier. But in some sense, there'll be an emotional, existential, empathetic connect, sometimes corporeal connect, right? So different subjects share one trauma. So, the idea of listening to another's wound, although not understanding, mind you, there's a difference between listening and understanding. But the fact that the wound is being listened to a certain extent, that creates a sense of solidarity, that creates a sense of connectedness. So there is this connective quality about trauma that Carruth is offering, where subjects can sort of connect to each other through trauma, through the wound, through the voice which emerges from the wound. There's a sort of viscerality about the voice. It's emerging through the wound. It's almost like true matter, right? So it's not just, what we can see is it's not just a trauma that is on the other side, but it's also a trauma which can be shared, it can be transmitted, although never quite understood, right? And that bit is there, that bit remains, the mystery of trauma, the enigma of trauma, the ununderstood quality of trauma. But despite not being understood fully, there is that connect, there is an existential, experiential connect that trauma can create. And what it does, at the very least, is it creates the possibility of the encounter with the other, with another. The encounter could be violent, the encounter could be unsettling, the encounter is obviously traumatic, but it does establish some dialogue, it does establish some connect, right? So in a very perverse way, sometimes trauma can be the only mode through which the encounter with the other can be achieved. Now, just to sum up what Carruth is doing over here, so at the very outset, she started off talking about the repetitive quality of trauma in terms of how the traumatic mind can only be understood through repetitions. That's one. The other is obviously the uncanny quality of trauma, something which can only emerge from the other side through the wound. That so the fact of through the wound becomes interesting. And the third thing that she talks about, again drawing on psychoanalysis and Freud, is the interplay of what is known and what is unknown, and the acceptance of the unknown, the articulation, the acknowledgement of the unknown. Right, to a large extent, the traumatized mind or the traumatic subject can never be known, can never be understood fully, and that lack of fullness of understanding is something which is acknowledged by Carruth. And of course, that's where the literary text and the traumatized subject can sort of converge, and the literariness of language is, as Carruth mentioned, is both an invitation to meaning, an invitation to a different order of meaning, as well as a defiance of meaning. And therein lies the strangeness, the almost translucent quality about literary language. It's transparent and opaque at the same time. There is that translucent quality. Now, lastly, what Carruth is offering in a very original framework is to look at the idea of trauma being some kind of a connective model. So despite being mysterious, despite being the fact that the other subject can never know the trauma of the suffering subject, what trauma can also do is that it can create some sense of solidarity to suffering, maybe different degrees of suffering. So in this case, Tancred's suffering is very different from Clorinda's suffering. So Tancred is the person who killed Clorinda. So there is some kind of guilt there, and that leads on to trauma, that informs the trauma. But at the same time, Clorinda is actually the person who got killed. So the person with an actual physical wound, the actual traumatic wound, because the word trauma comes from bodily wound. But at the same time, we find that there is a voice which connects them. There is a voice, an anguished voice, a painful voice, a tragic voice, a suffering voice, which actually connects them. Which brings us to the final point that we will end with today, that Carruth has mentioned, that the trauma can produce an encounter with another, which would otherwise not be available, and through the encounter, the very possibility and surprise of listening to another's wound. So there is that intersubjective, intercorporeal quality of trauma through which someone else's wound can be listened to, if not understood, but at least listened to. And the fact that it's listened to through a voice, and that is some kind of a literalization of a metaphor. If we go back to the story of Tancred and Clorinda, when Tancred cuts the leaf again, he hears the voice, the anguished, suffering voice of Clorinda, who he had killed earlier. Right, so the voice connects. Despite the fact that the voice is not understood, but the viscerality of the voice, the corporeality of the voice, the humanness of the voice is exactly what creates some kind of solidarity, some kind of connect through the traumatic encounter. Right, so we'll stop at this point today, and we'll begin to wind up Kathy Carruth's book in subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.